coming up on this episode of the Roundtable.
Isn't it weird that people will volunteer and urge their own children to go through with weird, horrible gender kind of realignment, just speaking euphemistically, like, gender realignment. It's one thing to be okay with that for another kid, but to do it to your kid, and often with great enthusiasm and such. I mean, you would think that the civilizational guardrails or the guardrails of sanity would prevent a parent from even considering such a thing, and yet here we are.
Hello, and welcome to the Roundtable, the editor's podcast of The American Mind. This is your host for today, Seth Barron. I'm managing editor of The American Mind. I'm filling in for our usual host, Spencer Clavin, who is currently jetting across the Atlantic, I believe. I'm joined by, we have a bunch of guests today, so it's going to be an unusual and exciting roundtable. I am joined by Ryan Williams, the president of the Claremont Institute, publisher of The American Mind and the Claremont Review of Books. We also have Kyle Shideler, the director and senior analyst for Homeland Security and Counterterrorism at the Center for Security Policy. He's a Claremont Lincoln Fellowship alumnus. We have Dave Reaboi, president of Strategic Improvisation, the author of The Late Republic Nonsense Substack, and a Claremont Lincoln alum and a current fellow of the Claremont Institute. Finally, we have Michael Anton, lecturer and research fellow at Hillsdale's DC campus and a senior fellow of the Claremont Institute. So buckle up. I think it's going to be an exciting roundtable. The big news today or this week seems to be the Russia-Ukraine war. The G7 countries have announced that they will back Kyiv, as we must pronounce it, for as long as it takes. I'm not exactly sure what that means or what that time frame is, but after the destruction of the Russia-Crimea bridge earlier this week, the rather stupendous fireball that wiped it out, Russia has become sort of aggrieved and have been taking it out on Ukraine in the form of missile attacks, which have been decried as war crimes, et cetera, et cetera. Now we've seen news about tactical nuclear weapons, nuclear war, all of this, which for the last 75 years has, been considered to be the absolute, this is like beyond the beyond, talking about having nuclear war. Now, it's something that we all have to learn to love and accept. Possibility that we're going to have a nuclear war coming our way. I'm just going to throw it open. What do you guys think about what does for as long as it takes really mean?
Well, it literally means presumably until Russia is defeated, withdraws, restores every inch of Ukrainian territory, including the stuff taken in 2014, and gets nothing from the invasion and basically accepts the West's maximalist demands and total humiliation. So since they're not going to do that, then that begs the question, what does as long as it takes really mean? And I don't know. Is the plan to just somehow have all out war with Russia to the point where, are we demanding unconditional surrender? Is this like the Tehran conference in 1943 all over again? Biden has himself talked about regime change in Moscow a couple of times. So I think this is one of those questions where until they clarify, if they clarify, I don't know that anybody else can answer it.
The Beltway foreign policy class has been, I've been talking about this forever, maybe more than a decade since I first began to notice that they have been single-mindedly kind of hoping for regime change in Russia for quite some time. Usually they've been pretty tight-lipped about it, but at this point, that's really what they want. It's completely fascinating how obsessed they are with this point. Makes me think that as much as they see China and sort of other strategic threats on the horizon, they cling even more strongly to their anti-Russia position.
Well, there are a lot of vested interests in that field or front or whatever you want to call it. I mean, you have the entire NATO apparatus, which creates any number of posts that need to be filled and jobs that can be taken. So I think there's always been a extended desire to keep that going, even after, there's pretty serious questions about the validity of NATO nowadays. I mean, people forget that, like, after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse in 91, I mean, there was even discussion about inviting Russia into NATO. In fact, Putin himself asked to be invited into NATO. Now, how serious that was, I don't know. But, so you have this weird situation where NATO has, on the one hand, changed its purpose for existing, and then on the other hand is also sort of falling back into old patterns. So on the one hand, they're doing this sort of maximalist, democracy everywhere, kind of Kosovo, back to Kosovo and Libya stuff in their rhetoric. And then at the same time, they're also falling back into old patterns. They're taking all of that stuff into this current situation with the Russians, rather than sort of the steely-eyed, dealing with Russia that we would have seen back during the Cold War when NATO was relevant.
Well, I'm old enough to remember when it was very uncool on the left and among elites to be anti-Russia. That was the sign of a mouth-breathing troglodyte, know-nothing, moron conservative to be anti-Russia when Russia was communist. Now that Russia is whatever it is, nationalist and quasi-orthodox, you're required to be anti-Russia. Like, you're a traitor. You're an evil person if you're not sufficiently anti-Russia. It's crazy how this all turns on a dime. When Russia poses an existential threat to the West and is hell bent on ideological world conquest, the worst thing you can be is anti-Russia. When Russia is a much lesser power, more or less contained. I mean, I use the qualifier more or less because obviously it's able to project power in its immediate neighborhood, but is not able to project power in the way that it could at the height of the Cold War. Well, then now you're required to hate the Russians. It's very hard to keep up with.
Not only required to hate them, but any, as we've all observed, any even modest qualified suggestion that there ought to be some negotiated settlement to this conflict to end it, you're just a Putin shill. You see this interesting phenomenon of a couple of guys you could call old friends from the PayPal mafia making arguments in different forums. David Sachs and Elon Musk, Elon on Twitter, David on the Newsweek opinion editorial page, making arguments for the kind of madness of the escalation ladder we seem to be ascending with Russia. The madness because, of course, Russia, though much diminished, still has thousands of nuclear weapons that could blow up the globe many times over. So this is interesting. And it seems like however high status, Elon, of course, the richest man in the world or close, however high status individual makes anything against the party line, nothing really matters. You're just immediately denounced. Mike, I wonder what you think of our diplomatic conduct. I recall to mind, I was talking with one of our former Lincoln fellows the other day who lives here in Orange County, and I recounted to him one of Angela's favorite quotes from Teddy Roosevelt was, the really wrong, bad thing one should avoid in diplomacy is to combine the unbridled tongue with the unready hand. We're not quite experiencing an unready American hand here. I mean, we're shoveling money at Ukraine, but we certainly have had an unbridled tongue in all matters of foreign policy, let alone this conflict, for decades. It really has not gone well for us leading up to now. I don't understand why our bipartisan ruling class just has lost this very old and very wise notion.
Well, I wish their hand were a little less ready. That is to say, if I'd rather them be hypocrites and talk a big game and not ship all of these arms over there, not give targeting information that gets Russian 3-star generals killed, and that just doesn't, for the lack of it, for drag us further into the conflict in ways that are guaranteed to antagonize Moscow. So by all means, any deep stater who's listening to this, feel free to be as hypocritical as you want. I won't point it out. In fact, I'll even praise you for it. You bring up Teddy Roosevelt. So Teddy Roosevelt won the Nobel Peace Prize. As far as I know, I'm pretty sure this is correct. He's the only U.S. president ever to win the Nobel Peace Prize. And he won it specifically for negotiating an end to the Russo-Japanese War of 1905, right? So many have said, including Musk and others who have weighed in, have said, look, if there's going to be a negotiated settlement to this, the United States has to be the lead negotiator or in the middle of it, because Russia thinks that this is a proxy war being supported by, led by, egged on by the United States. But how can we be the lead negotiator when we've so obviously taken sides against one side and for the other side? I mean, we've said on the record, we accept all of Ukrainian demands, we reject all Russian demands. That makes it impossible for you to step in between the parties and be trusted as any kind of serious player, as a mediator. So if it's true that a negotiated settlement must involve the United States, then I don't even see how we begin that process unless there's some complete about face from the Biden administration, which obviously I don't predict, or we have to wait 2 years if there is another administration in 2 years. But if there were some kind of complete about face, they'd also have to come up with entirely new personnel. So that means either Blinken and Austin and Sullivan and all these people have to resign. I don't really foresee that. Or they would just have to outsource this the way sort of, let's say, Bill Clinton did outsource the Balkans negotiation to Richard Holbrooke. Find somebody, some Democratic elder statesman, or maybe one of each, some Republican elder statesman, some Democratic elder statesman, kind of moderates from both parties who have the stature, who haven't mouthed off about the war, and just say, look, you have a fairly free hand to go do this. But I mean, I don't know. I see no sign that this administration is even willing to consider such a course of action.
Well, Mike, let me just point out that the perfect person for this, to be the neutral, wise elder statesman, would be the only other president to have won the Nobel Peace Prize, Barack Obama, of course.
Oh, that's right. He did win it, didn't he? How could I have forgotten How could I have forgotten the peace prize that Barack Obama won before he even took office, therefore memorializing the great accomplishments of his life as a community organizer on the south side of Chicago?
Well, it also was it was perspective, because then, of course, he went and oversaw and did nothing about Russia's invasion of Crimea, which presumably set everything up for where we're at now. What is all this happy noise about nuclear war I've been seeing lately? Like people saying, nuclear war is actually a lot more survivable than you might think. And indeed, most of the targets are places like Minot, North Dakota, or just various Air Force bases and things like that. Is this like some Booz Allen or Rand Institute talk?
Rand for sure. I mean, Rand exists to do. It was created to do exactly these kinds of studies in the immediate post-World War II era. But I'll say something about that. But first, just very quickly on Obama. On the one hand, he might be the ideal person in that Obama was actually pretty soft on the Russians throughout his 2 terms. We can point to the reset. Famously, we can point to the famous hot mic incident with Medvedev saying, I'll have a lot more flexibility after the next election. And we can point to the events of 2014, which Obama reacted to rather coolly. I think, though, the problem is that Putin would rightly see Obama as of a piece with the current people who run and rule the Democratic Party, that is all in on, American and Western neoliberalism generally, that is pushing this and not trust him. But hey, if you could trust him, and if we could find, some other person to travel, I have an idea. Well, how about Trump and Obama together, right? So we get the one pro-Ukraine ex-president and the one allegedly pro-Russian ex-president for balance. Maybe that could solve this problem. Now, as for nukes, yes, it has been thought out in great detail. If you're talking about, you mentioned North Dakota, the reason that would be is thought of is because all of the American hardened ICBM silos are in the Great Plains and basically in the emptiest parts of the central part of the north central part of the United States, right? Where you take the least civilian casualties if those are struck. Now, that assumes some kind of Russian first strike to take out a retaliatory capability on the part of the United States, which assumes an all-out nuclear war. A lot more likely is, and I still hope is unlikely and never happens, but a lot more likely would be some kind of Russian strike within Ukraine itself against perhaps a military target that the Russians think would be of tactical value to destroy, and that would offer a demonstration of Russian resolve, not so great as to provoke American or European or NATO retaliation, but great enough to scare the hell out of everybody into maybe backing down. And the reason people are worried about this is a specific Russian nuclear doctrine that they've written on and published called escalate to de-escalate. And it's basically a way of using one of Russia's last genuine military advantages over the West, that is to say, a slightly larger nuclear arsenal, but a much larger nuclear arsenal when it comes to low yield or tactical nuclear weapons, that they could use those to their advantage. That's the escalation, is using them. The de-escalate would be the response, it is hoped, on the part of the West would be to be so terrified and shocked by the use of nuclear weapons that they would back down before things got worse. That's one of those theories, though, that you can only test in operation, and you don't really know how it's going to turn out from Moscow's perspective. So it's kind of scary even to contemplate.
So I'm going to disagree. I think it's I think the nuclear talk now is political, and it's mostly nonsense. I don't think there's a scenario where Putin uses nuclear weapons, even of a small kind, even inside Ukraine, because the pressure on his military will be too great. I mean, even if he makes the order, very few people are going to want to carry it out, knowing the kinds of reprisals that are going to come from the West. Number one. Number two is, I think that all of this talk, all of the nuclear war stuff, serves to advance the narrative of the very familiar narrative that that Putin is a madman, that Putin is Hitler, that Putin is the personification of evil, and that we need to sort of continue in Ukraine. I've been saying for years that the left has no foreign enemies. It has foreigners who remind them of domestic enemies. And in such a way, the left and, frankly, the never Trump, neocon right has been enlisted in this foreign policy battle. I'm not going to say against their will, but they are being pushed by domestic politics. They've demonized Russia and Putin to such an extent over the last 5 years that they can't sit back and say, well, okay, we're going to make peace now. He's got to be as evil as the domestic opponents they face in the United States, which is to say us are. And I don't think they can afford to kind of rhetorically or ideologically, they can't afford to take their foot off the gas pedal.
Dave, don't you think some of this, though, is driven by the fact that they believe the talking point that Russia represents a kind of backward view of domestic policy toward religiosity, tradition, 2 instead of 91 genders, resistance to the normalization of transgenderism, homosexuality, and stuff like that. So that it's, in other words, they now take seriously that Russia represents some kind of enemy more than just an abstract foreign threat.
I think that's true. I think that's true, but it also can be kind of pushing towards oversold because, we're not dealing with unbelievably perceptive people here. I go and I read Applebaum, to the extent that I can sort of get around her Twitter block on me.
Better you than me.
But like I read these people and I'm curious. I mean, I asked Adam Kinzinger yesterday on Twitter. I was like, okay, can you do me a favor and define what you mean by democracy in such a way that you do not, that you do it in a positive way and not like, oh, it's whatever our enemies hate, or it's democracy is the flip side of the authoritarianism of Trump and blah blah blah. All that is kind of BS rhetoric. I think that their entire kind of political program, their worldview, in addition to it being crazy, is also really, really shallow. and not particularly well thought out.
Well, I think
Kyle was
that
gonna
gets
say
to
something.
how blinded they are by this hatred you're describing, Dave. Because I mean, the broad strokes of the doctrine you laid out, Mike, have been known in the U.S. for decades. I mean, my old professor Yuri Renan up at Boston University used to say all the time, when the Russians start issuing blood-curdling threats, it means they want to talk. It means they want out. You know, we know Putin went to the big counterterrorism conference. He met with Xi looking for support for the Ukraine war, and he didn't get it. Apparently, the Chinese told him to wrap this up as quickly as possible. And so he's looking for a way out. And so he's, upping his rhetoric to try to convince, somebody in the Washington establishment to let's have a serious conversation. And he can't get it, which I think is part of that, the venom that has crept into it. And I'm not even sure how much of this isn't the tail wagging the dog. I mean, we saw from Biden's language about Armageddon. I'm not sure he wouldn't rather sit down and talk too, but it's not possible for all the reasons that Dave said, because, the blue check mark mafia and the Ukraine flag flyers on Twitter are just driving the social conversation to such a degree that I think they have boxed themselves in. And it's part of what, once you deploy this swarm to mobilize against your enemies, they become somewhat, powerless to control where it goes. And I think that they're trying to figure, hopefully there's somebody in the administration trying to figure out how to get off this thing. But that's the force that they unleashed.
Yeah, it's funny, this whole question about democracy. I mean, this is just switching domestically. I saw, I guess it was Beto O'Rourke in Texas was talking to Trevor Noah. And Trevor Noah said, it's just so remarkable because you're so popular nationally. But in Texas, you don't seem to be able to get much of a foothold in these statewide races. And Beto said, yes, well, it's a function of the failure of democracy in Texas, meaning, I guess, if people don't like me, that means that democracy has failed. I mean, is it really just that stupid? I mean, is that really what they're saying, that we are democracy, and if you cross us or if you oppose us, if you don't like us, then we're going to be as resolute. I mean, the left at this point sounds about as reactionary as like some Birchers in 1960 saying that Eisenhower was a red agent.
Yeah.
I mean, they've pretty much, that's the extent to which I think Biden would have trouble negotiating with Putin, because how could you do that? That's like the same thing as, working for Trump, essentially.
I learned from Caldwell on this, that is to say, Chris Caldwell, who is now with us at the Claremont Institute as a contributing editor and writer for the Weekly Standard, and is maybe the world's leading, he's certainly the leading American expert on things European.
Former Weekly Standard.
Claremont Review Books. He's certainly the foremost American expert on European politics, and he may be the best expert on European politics, including the Europeans. I know some Europeans who think he is. And he said that before this happened here, democracy, the meaning of the word democracy mutated in Europe to mean essentially progressive outcomes, right? So democracy is a process that yields ever more progressive outcomes in a march toward a more equitable future and so on. And once accomplished, you can't go backward in their view. That would be undemocratic. So if the EU decides that, say, homosexual marriage must be, but then some recalcitrant member state votes against it, in the textbook definition of democracy, the vote means it's democratic, but in the new meaning of democracy, it's backward regress from the desired end state, and so it's undemocratic. The Americans, I think, who use this language have adopted that completely. And I think at the top tier of the intellect, however smart the smartest among the regime rulers are, they know that they're being cynical and misusing the term. But when you hear people like Beto, I don't think is all that smart, or the average Twitter leftist using the word democracy, they just haven't thought it through. right? To them, on the one hand, you could, it's like if we all remember the old Star Trek, I'm just going to assume that we do. If I'm the only one who watched it, well, okay, whatever. But you know how they one frequent plot device was talking a computer to death. Right? You have this evil computer that's ruling you, taking over the ship or something, and they get out of it by forcing it to think about a contradiction, and it can't compute, and it blows up. Like smoke comes out of literally like the head of the computer. And so, like, I think that's what happens to these people. It's like, well, but wait, democracy is when people vote on something and majority rules, right? Yes. But then if they vote like against gay marriage and majority says we don't want it, that's also democratic. And they just and they don't know what to say.
Yeah, no, I would agree with you. That sort of leads me to wonder about a recent article that we saw in New York Magazine by Jonathan Chait, who attended a few weeks ago, a month ago, the National Conservative Conference in Miami, where he said that Republican politicians, right-wing thought leaders, and various party apparatchiks had gathered to articulate their vision of the conservative movement's future. He noted that the halls of the Miami Marriott were teeming with conservative networkers, and the panels were especially well stocked with a class of once marginal right-wing pundits: Joshua Hammer, Sean Davis, Molly Hemingway, Michael Anton, David Reaboi, who were far more in tune to the desires of the audience than the largely Trump-skeptical class of incumbent conservative columnists who still make appearances in the mainstream media, unquote. I think it's great that Chait is acknowledging that all of those people who, I believe all of them are associated with Claremont in one way or another, are really the trenchant observers of the scene and more representative of the conservative movement than, the usual crew. But I'm wondering, given that some of you were there, what your take on the liberal take of the Claremont Institute and national conservatism really is. We've been in the news a lot lately. There's been a lot of coverage. What do you make of this? And, Dave, I know that you had a bit of a interchange with this fellow who then took it very much askance and tried to make it seem as though you were, portraying him as some anti-Semitic gargoyle, like anti-Semitic stereotype of a gargoyle. I don't know how well he succeeded in making this claim, but I'm just wondering what you guys make of all of this.
I happen to know that Dave took all his meals at the conference with Jonathan Chait, all 3 a day, and they spent a lot of time together.
6
so I'd be
a
very
day.
interested. I'd be very interested to hear this answer as well.
Yeah, no, look. I mean, it's actually a great segue from the last topic, I think, because all of the reporting about national conservatism or Claremont or really whatever the new right more broadly just kind of emerges from this kind of our democracy trademark thing that they've done, that the redefinition of their policy preferences, their worldview as our democracy. So within that context, yeah, of course, it makes sense that we are the opposite. We are authoritarian. We are, semi-fascist, as that writer Jonathan Chait called us. I mean, of course we would be, because our vocabulary over the course of the last couple of decades has been reduced basically to things I don't like equals Hitler, and equals fascist equals Nazi. And that's just what they do. I mean, part of their propaganda is that democracy is great. We are the democracy. The democracy is us, and everyone who isn't us is, a filthy Nazi. And so all of the reporting, such as it is, comes from that premise. So, I mean, speaking for myself, I'm not really worried about it. I made a comment. When I saw Chait there, I made a comment, and I told him that he was the most full of shit writer around. And to which he kind of kept his head down, and he said, "Thank you." And then I kept going, and I just told him, "Look, I read you all the time because, it's like reading science fiction. It's like walking into a world where nothing makes sense and everything is completely crazy. I mean, he is I called him a fabulist. I mean, he didn't print that part, but yeah, I mean, it's kind of broken funhouse mirror zone. And
it was a pretty lame article. I mean, I've been attacked by this guy, I don't know, a dozen times or so, sometimes in articles that are devoted to me solely. Sometimes I'm just a drive-by in some larger piece. I didn't even read this one that carefully because, first of all, he had already addressed the goblin controversy quickly after the conference. But this apparently was the big takeout that his time there was leading to. And it just added up to nothing, I thought.
Who said that? Which is like, if you, this is the kind of thing that people who like this kind of thing will like.
Right. I mean, it's attributed to a lot of people, but Lincoln used it, so I don't know that he came up with it. It's also in a famous novel from the mid 20th century called "The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie." Anyway,
yeah. So it's kind of like that. It's another installment in a continuing hysterical series.
You know what it immediately reminded me of, which I looked up this morning, is Tom Wolfe's first book in 1965 was a collection of his magazine articles, and he wrote an introduction to it saying that like how he approached his job before he got good at it as a feature writer. Features meaning not hard news, but go out and tell us some interesting thing. And sometimes they would give him assignments, and one of the assignments he got was to go to like a custom motorcycle show in Columbus Circle. This is, this would be the early 60s. And he came back and he admittedly said he phoned it in. He gave the editors what he knew they wanted, which was a story sort of making fun of these people to tell his readers how they ought to view it. And he sums it up by saying, don't worry, these people are nothing. And I feel like that's what Chait's was. Wolf called it the totem story. But there was a weird contradiction. It was worry, these people are nothing. So on the one hand, they're totally gross, stupid losers. On the other hand, you need to be terrified of them. And there's just something about that kind of rhetoric that doesn't really add up. Like, you need to be scared of a monster. You don't need to be scared of a dork loser. And Chait hasn't figured out how to instill genuine fear while also communicating a real contempt and disdain.
Well, it's sort of part of the curious death of the hit piece in that the left doesn't really have, I mean, they've almost like worked their way through hit pieces to the point where they're almost back into straight reporting, where they will just literally report what you say and then think that this is sufficient to totally, exercise you from the public space, not realizing that, the people reading it, I mean, I'm sure the people reading it are lunatics, in the case of, Jonathan Chait, but like the average, normal mainstream American, if we can say that there is such a thing anymore, is not reading this, and B, if he read it, he might agree with what the people that he was sent that this reporter was sent there to slam are saying, because it's it's supposed to be self-refuting, and they think it's self-refuting because they're so divorced from anything outside of a progressive mindset that they don't even know how to address it.
Yeah, one of Leo Strauss's more famous lines from Persecution in the Art of Writing is where he talks about how to write esoterically. In other words, how to get by censors and communicate a subversive meaning. And he says, well, one trick is to, somewhere in the, pretend like you're denouncing something, and then somewhere in the middle of the article, state the opposing view in such perfectly lucid and clear language that it actually, just through the force of the logic alone, without you taking any kind of a stand, seems more compelling to the reader than the views that you are supposedly espousing, right? And I don't think Chait was trying to do that, but it may have that effect despite his best efforts.
Well, I mean, I think the question is, what is it that side is for that we're so against that they can feel justified in calling us semi-fascist? We don't want to, we're against, having no requirements for voting. We're against having open borders. We're for certain traditional definitions of the family and social life, but nothing like, for the most part, nothing particularly extreme. We're not in favor of, Reaganite neoliberalism, in a doctrinaire sense. But what is it that they are condemning us for, aside from just, the the manifest horribleness of the last Republican president in their mind.
Yeah. I mean, throughout the piece, not throughout it, but at certain points, Chait lamented and hyperventilated a bit about both the presence of Hungarians there and also the praise for Orban's Hungary. And, in Chait's view, Hungary is, he puts it this way. He says, a lot of people thought Putin's Russia was Hungary, looked a lot like Hungary, 15 years ago or whatever. And now we see where that's gotten. Orban seems to be doing the same thing. This seemed to be Chait's implicit argument. That is to say, the state is taking over, corrupting, controlling media, the height of corporate power, et cetera. And then Chait sort of laid alongside that the alarming argument he found at the conference which was that a party and movement formerly in favor of quote unquote, that used to be against quote unquote big government, was now arguing for the use of power, that is state power, to destroy, humiliate, and otherwise defund elements of the left. So that's where he saw kind of, incipient semi-fascism, I suppose. But then he has these whoppers where it's clear that Chait lives in some alternate universe, or he's so blinkered that he can't really see what seemed to us to be demonstrable truths, which, he said it's absurd. Their argument, that is the right's argument or the NatCon argument, that the heights of institutional power in the country are occupied by leftism is absurd. His biggest example, I guess, was the military. He said anyone who thinks that storied and inherently conservative institution has somehow been taken over by leftism is high. I mean, he didn't put it quite that way, but whereas, those of us who've been writing and observing this, it may be a storied conservative institution at the rank and file, but its leadership has all gone woke. I mean, it's obsessed with diversity, equity, and inclusion. From the military schools from its schools on military bases, as we documented in a recent report, all the way up to, Mark Milley talking about white rage and officers being assigned Ibram Kendi to read as part of their, expert level outside reading courses. So I don't know where Jonathan Chait lives or what he reads, but it seems surprisingly detached from the trends in our national life and in our institutions these days.
I think in terms of what they're afraid of or why they hate us, part of it is they just need an enemy to stay unified. And so we're useful for that. Part of it is a genuine fear that we may roll back some of their successes or what they think are successes. Look, they've not been stopped dead in their tracks on critical race theory and transgenderism exactly, but they've met a much fiercer resistance than they're used to meeting. They're used to being able to run the table on these things and get them implemented over token opposition, and then they become kind of permanent law of the land policy. And then the third is, I think they worry about the things they might not get if we are successful in opposition. I remember reading Bork's, not exactly autobiography, but the book that Robert Bork wrote and published after his confirmation battle in 1987. The book came out around 1990, I think, which was part constitutional theory and so on, but part a memoir of his time trying to be confirmed. And he said that someone, I forget who, told him, this battle, Judge Bork, wasn't really about despite they said, yes, they expected you to get in there and start rolling back all kinds of rights, but it wasn't really about that. What it was mostly about was all of the constitutional rights they wanted the court to declare in the future from the bench that they knew you wouldn't give them, and that you might rally other justices to stop from happening. And that's why you had to be destroyed. And Bork reports that conversation approvingly, as if to say, yeah, I think that's correct. I think that's what they worry about. Like, we can't, for them, progress means moving from one leftist victory to another, changing the goalposts constantly. Tomorrow's great crusade and moral imperative will be something no one ever thought of today, but it's just as imperative. And they don't want opposition that will prevent that march, in their view, forward and upward.
Well, I think you're right, too, when you say reaction is the thing that most terrifies them, or which most results in their over-the-top, fascism rhetoric. Which, you saw some of this, the strains of some of this with Biden in his, red speech, where it was pretty clear that, like, the thing that makes us semi-fascist is the fact that, Roe versus Wade was finally overturned. And, this was a rollback that immediately, sent us into the dark ages as far as they were concerned. And so, everything is on the table in terms of dealing with this reaction.
Yeah, it gets back to Dave's point, which is if we put it in fancy terms, the kind of latent or implicit historicism of the left, that is to say, their view of progress is both the good view, that is, the progress is good, and also that we're at a point in sort of human evolution and political evolution where you don't go back on these certain things. So the narrative around when Dobbs first came out was like, this is the unprecedented thing. This has never happened. The Supreme Court, for the first time in the modern era, took away a right that was there. And so it meshes very well with the our democracy business. So, I mean, if the alternatives seem to be our democracy, that is progressive democracy and the goals of progressivism, and anything else is semi-fascism or fascism. That's the Manichaean idiocy that we deal with a good portion of the left today on the journalism side and in the academy and elsewhere.
Well, it's funny. It seems like if you cross them in any way, it's really like, a woman scorned. Not to be sexist, but that's the typology. So we're seeing now the federal government basically using their January 6th playbook to arrest anyone who they can look at old videos and find someone standing in the sidewalk outside of an abortion clinic, telling their rosary or singing a hymn. Oh, well, they violated the federal clinic access laws. They can be brought, arrested. They can be sent to prison for 20 years. We can, round up anyone who they texted about it. And so it seems like that's the strategy. But it's a good segue because I wanted to mention this journal article. It's kind of obscure journal article that Ryan brought my attention to. It's from the Journal of Medical Ethics, which appears to be a reputable journal. I mean, I looked it up and I looked up these authors. They seem to be actual people, not just like trolls or, secret right-wing, pranksters. After birth abortion, why should the baby live? And basically they're saying abortion is largely accepted even for reasons that do not have anything to do with the fetus's health. So that being said, in what sense should people not be allowed to end a fetus's life after it's born, even if there's no particular good reason? Even once these children are born, there's no choice for the parents but to keep the child, which sometimes is exactly what they would not have done if the disease had been diagnosed before birth. But even if there is no disease, if for whatever reason the parents don't want to keep the children, what exactly is the difference between killing the baby while the woman is pregnant or afterward? Now, these people are all for it. And now there's some kind of, utilitarian types, devotees of Peter Singer, ethicists, applied philosophers, what have you. Alberto Giubilini and Francesco Minerva are their names. And you read this and it does sort of seem like it's all an elaborate thought experiment. But, as Christopher Caldwell's pointed out, like everything that is condemned as a slippery slope fallacy, from gay marriage to the extremes of affirmative action to, transgender genital mutilation on 6-year-olds, everything that's condemned as, oh, that's a slippery slope argument at the beginning winds up being true. So I'm just wondering what you guys think. Are we headed towards post-birth abortion? Is this the next logical step for the left, at least in the states that, permit abortion? That now, it used to be that, oh, well, of course, late-term abortion, we don't want that. But now, of course, you won't find a Democrat who's opposed to it.
I don't know how close we're headed to it in the States, even in blue states in America. I think there's a kind of strand of, it's dimmer now, but there's a strand of individualist Christianity that really just recoils at this kind of thing. That's deeper maybe in our bones and DNA in America than many would otherwise recognize. But I think it's the logic of the abortion jurisprudence from the beginning. The companion case. So we've talked about this, but it's been many months, I think, if not over a year. But Roe v. Wade was the original, and the original set up the trimester system, and so basically said, states can't really do much in the first trimester. They can do a little more to protect or balance the, interests of protection of life, the interest of protecting the life of the fetus with the mother's interests in having an abortion. They can do a little more in second trimester, and states can do a lot more in the third trimester, with a carve out for the famous exceptions: rape, incest, or health of the mother. The companion case was called Doe v. Bolton, and it defined health of the mother in line with the World Health Organization's laying out of what that meant, and that included psychological health. So I can envision, even beyond this sort of leading edge weirdness of the Journal of Medical Ethics discussing killing children outside the womb, it makes sense. I mean, if your child in some of their examples, if your child contracts a horrible disease that's going to wrench your family apart, cause you great psychological stress, why wouldn't it be better under their reasoning to just end that child's life before everyone has to go through that? And you see that logic already at play in Europe with the rise of euthanasia in parts of Europe. I think it's completely consistent with what we've seen recently in Europe, that if a panel of doctors and experts and the responsible parties, that is the adults to that child, decide it's in the best interest of, the more progressed human beings, that is to say the rational adults, to do something like this, I don't see where any principled argument could intervene and stop it. So in that sense, to the extent that, very deep blue America continues to head the way of this cross-Atlantic consensus on matters of life, expediency, expert rule, and mother's quote-unquote right to choose, I think it's not crazy at all to see this as somewhere we might be led.
I mean, it just seems like paganism with extra steps. Like
bureaucratic paganism. You heard the phrase here first, people.
No, I mean, it kind of makes sense. It's of a piece with the really where they are, where the left is, where they see these things, which is that children are, or let's say, pregnancy or motherhood or being a parent is primarily an experience that of a journey of fulfillment for the parents, as opposed to something about the children. And in that context, I mean, it kind of makes sense in line with their philosophy. It's like, and you see this a lot in different adoption scenarios. It's like, well, why shouldn't, with regards to gay adoption and things like that? Well, why I want the experience of having a child. Well, like, I mean, that's great and everything, but it's primarily not an experience of self-fulfillment for you. It's actually the kid's life, primarily, and that should be the primary concern. But if you see things that way, then it kind of makes sense. It's like, hey, you know what? I'm on this journey of parenting, and I've decided I've had enough. And so, why not? Well, let's put a stop to it. I mean, I could see how, Ryan, I think you're right. There's probably still, some little vestige of reasonableness and something left in the American population, even in blue states. But I can see how some people follow their ideology to this point. I mean, look, isn't it weird that people will volunteer and urge their own children to go through with weird, horrible gender kind of realignment, just speaking euphemistically, like, gender realignment. It's one thing to be okay with that for another kid, but to do it to your kid, and often with great enthusiasm and such. I mean, you would think that the civilizational guardrails or the guardrails of sanity would prevent a parent from even considering such a thing. And yet here we are.
I mean, in terms of what's next, it almost depends on which part of the progressive coalition gets the hold of the megaphone first and screams the loudest. I've likened them in a way to a flock of birds. I don't think there is a ruling mind telling them, but they fight a little bit. When the decks are cleared and they've accomplished the last thing, it's not clear what they're going to do next. There's usually a brief period, call it 6 months. I don't know how long it takes, where they're not sure what. Once it's determined, then they all get in line. So it could be this, post-birth abortion, or let's just call it what it is, infanticide. It could be polyamory. Again, or polygamy. We saw a judge rule in New York State, a week ago, that the logic of Obergefell demands that you can't limit marriage by number. So you can have a 3-person, a 4, who knows? Or it could be, they've been pushing some form of, to put this in delicate terms, lowering of the age of consent for a long time, or to put it in indelicate terms, pederasty for a long time. I doubt it's the latter, because that's going to be probably the hardest bridge for them to cross. And they've been smacked around pretty badly by their losses on the transgender front, or at least not, if not yet their losses, although there have been some, at least the pushback. Maybe the polyamory is an easy way to go because it's an easy sell as on sort of libertarian live and let live grounds. And all of the old defenses that defined marriage in a biblical or natural law way have been completely broken down. So that's an open door. On the other hand, the reason to think they might go with infanticide is the outrage over Dobbs has got the pro-choice activists so revved up that they may just completely overcorrect and say, well, this just proves that any limits whatsoever are an inherent evil, and so we got to go to the maximum now for to correct this. I make no prediction as to what's coming next, except that I do think the third one that I mentioned is probably the least likely, at least in the near term.
I like it. Basically, it seems like a good rule when it comes to how the left thinks is, if it can be considered, be it political strategy or something that the medical establishment and the surgeons can do, that's sure to come. Listen, this has been a great podcast. It's been a great episode of the Roundtable. I want to thank our guests, Mike Anton, Dave Reaboi, and Kyle Shideler, for joining us. If you enjoy listening to the Roundtable, please go ahead and give us 5 stars on Apple or whatever platform you're hearing. It really helps our presence in the algorithm to get the 5 stars. If you have any quibbles, why don't you keep them to yourself? We don't, need to hurt the algorithm. I'm Seth Barron. Thank you for joining us on the Roundtable, and you'll hear from us next week.